welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Ahmed
and Eric Olson.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with Ahmed and Eric. Today, we're going to be looking at memory, which is ironically a very important part of the MCAT, both in terms of a studying capacity, but also the topic in terms of testable material. Before we dive into memory, Eric, can you recall for us how the past week as a resident has been for you?
Yeah.
Dive into that short-term memory.
Yeah, well, medium, long. I had a mandatory week off the last week of June. They gave us 3 weeks of vacation over the year. It sounded good. Like I say, I had a mandatory week off, and it's like, that sounds great. But it was 3 weeks off during the whole year, and one of those weeks, they made us take the last week of June.
I see.
But we had to move and everything, so we're getting set up here in our new place, and I'm like a couple days in to my new program, and it's been a lot of like figuring out your password and like doing the training and getting the right apps on your phone so you can log in and stuff like that. It's been a lot of the semantics.
Right.
I start seeing patients in clinic tomorrow, so we'll have to touch base again later, and I can tell you how that's going. It's like daunting, but at the same time, like I've been a doctor for a year, even though it's kind of in a different capacity, and like you see lots of patients in med school too, and so it's like it's just a different. It's like first day of school jitters, but I feel like I have some experience. It's been going. How are you getting ready to start school here soon, or what is that looking like?
Yeah, start orientation. Today's we're filming this on a Tuesday, so I start 7 weeks yesterday.
All right. So you got still a little time. So
yeah, still some time, and then classes would be 8 weeks yesterday. So we get like a week of orientation. But remind me again, where did you move to and from?
From Atlanta, Georgia.
Yeah.
To
I figured where Atlanta was.
Yeah. Sorry. To Birmingham, Alabama. So it wasn't as far. It wasn't nearly as far. When we moved to Atlanta, it was from Michigan, so it was like a big drive and kind of a big change. It's just like just across the border, like a couple hours. So it wasn't as extreme.
Right.
But new house, and like the kids are getting used to it, and my daughter has all of a sudden like decided she's afraid of the dark, and so we're like, she's waking up in the night scared, and it's just like a lot of change, like it's a lot to get used to. So
yeah, fair enough. Well, all the best with that. I know I was talking to Jaden on our last episode. He kind of mentioned the same thing. Being a year 2 resident is a big difference from being a year 1 resident. And so obviously wishing you all the best with that. Don't think you'll need any luck though. I'm sure you'll be just fine.
Okay.
But all the best tomorrow. But in any case, memory-wise, it's funny. Like in that example, you touched on a lot of episodic memory, right? There was maybe a little bit of semantic memory in there in terms of knowing that year 2 of residency comes after year 1 of residency. And as simple as that example may sound, I think having examples for the different types of memory is really important, because it's easy to get them mixed up, especially episodic and semantic as components of long-term memory. But we'll get into that as we go. We'll start maybe on the short end and then work all the way up to long-term, looking at some like forgetting, interference, all that kind of stuff later. Starting with sensory memory. That's the shortest of like the memory stores or capacities that we have. 2 main components to sensory memory, would you say, Eric, being echoic and iconic?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I would just say, it's important to recognize that these are kind of all part of the process of like long-term encoding. Like when we're learning information, like we're encoding it into our memory, and that's kind of the terminology that's used. And so, as you say, we want to talk about like start on the short end of things and move to like longer term memory. And so that kind of progression from like the shortest term of memory being the episodic memory to the long-term memory is like part of this encoding process of sticking something where it's not going to be forgotten, right?
Sorry, just clarifying there, Eric. Shortest stored memory being the sensory memory.
Oh, sensory. Yeah, my apologies. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks for catching me there. So iconic and echoic, right? I think honestly, most of the time when I've seen this in questions, I don't think these terms come up a lot, but I have seen them once in a while, and so it is important to just be familiar with them. Iconic being kind of like your visual sensory memory, and echoic being your auditory sensory memory. And that sensory memory is just like what lasts just a few seconds in your head. It's not something that you're like really putting thought into. And I was thinking about, I knew we were going to be talking about this, and I was thinking about some of the things I was doing today. And like I did a lot of phone calls to the IT support today. And so, like at certain points, I would be on the phone with IT, and someone would say something to me, or be like kind of conversing in the background, and I wouldn't be paying any attention. And they would say, "Eric, what do you think about that?" Or like, "Eric, what's going on over there?" And I would have to like capture back to what they had said previously. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
that's kind of what this echoic memory is. It's like it's not something that you're necessarily paying that much attention to, but it's kind of just stored in your head. You know what I mean? It's the same kind of thing. Like if you're in class and you're not really paying attention, you're on your phone, and like your teacher or professor is, lecturing, and then they call on you. Like you weren't paying attention. You weren't like really picking that stuff up, but
Yeah.
it's kind of sitting in your head. You know what I mean? So you can kind of pull it out, and remember what they said and convince them that you were paying attention.
Right. The class like, huh? What? Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Exactly. And then the other thing that I think is maybe less important to know, but may come up is that in our kind of constructs of how these sorts of processing go in our head, sometimes we'll refer to the central executive as well, which is like your, little executive brain piece that's like putting these pieces of information together in your head. And that's kind of, is that part of working memory actually, now that I'm thinking about it?
well, it is, but I think that's a really good segue into short-term memory because, with sensory memory, it doesn't necessarily require conscious attention, right?
Yeah.
It's just kind of there, right? And so if I was to tell somebody, memorize the next 7 words I say, they're going to hear the things that I say, right? And by giving it conscious attention, now it moves into working memory. That's the next
Yeah.
step to actually encoding it, right? But if I hadn't said that, heck, I don't remember what I said, 25 words ago, right? Because
Yeah.
it's not something that I'm like actively attending to. But, I think from a just conceptual standpoint, that makes sense, right? Lots of input, right? Coming around us. And, there's a lot going on, right? And so, we can get into the cocktail party effect where because there's so many stimuli, we pay attention to just a couple, but then we hear something that's significant, like our own name. Now that gets our attention. But just at baseline, right, we have so many stimuli going on from the sounds we hear to the things we see to the things we smell. And so naturally, our brain kind of dials down the sensory, we'll say attention. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to, evaluate everything. But
Yeah.
moving into the working memory and the short-term memory, now we start to get into, conscious attention to things. I think that might be a good place to start, is just distinguishing between short-term memory and working memory. And the way that it's always been explained to me is working memory is a form of short-term memory where you're consciously manipulating information as opposed to just like rote rehearsal, right? So like if you were to give me a list of 5 words and I just keep repeating the words in my head, repeat, 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 I don't know that that would be classified as working memory because it doesn't really involve much manipulation. Whereas If you gave me the 5 words and now I sorted them alphabetically and I tried to connect them to things, that would be a little bit more manipulative in nature, and
Yeah.
that would fit the description of working memory. Is that sort of in line with how it's been taught for you,
Yeah.
Eric?
Yeah, I think from like a strict definition point of view, and like if they asked you to distinguish between the two, I would wholeheartedly agree. Like I think the working memory, and that exactly is the word that I've heard used multiple times to describe it, is this idea of manipulation, right? Like you don't just have those pieces of information, but you're somehow, manipulating them, arranging them, rearranging them, utilizing them in some fashion that's not just like a phone number. You know what I mean?
Right, right.
That said, like I don't know if they're really going to be asking you to distinguish between the two. I think
Agreed.
it's possible. They certainly could give you a piece of information, some scenario, and say, of these types of memory, which type of memory is being used here. But I think in my experience, they'll often put either working or short term as an answer choice. And I don't
Right,
know if I really have ever even seen the two of them next to each other when one of them is the right answer, if that makes sense. Like if the right answer is sensory memory, they might put those two there just to throw you off. But I think by and
right.
large, they're used pretty interchangeably on the MCAT.
Yeah, and that's one thing that, I try to tell students is oftentimes the MCAT isn't as, we'll say, strict or thorough as the courses they may have taken in their
Yeah.
undergraduate degree, right? Like if you took a Psych 101, you may have gone into the depths of the difference between, you know, working memory and short-term memory. Or if you took a stats class, you may have been yelled at that there's, no such thing as more significant, and that significance is binary. It either is
Yeah.
or it isn't. But you will see the MCAT give you multiple levels of significance sometimes and say one is more significant than the other. Or you'll see it in a textbook or whatever the case may be. But I think, the main message there being sometimes knowing a little bit less can be better. Not to say like ignore info, but just understand the depths to which the MCAT will go relative to things that you've seen already.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that I think is really like a hallmark of working memory is this idea of like chunking or clustering. I can't. I think I'm getting this from a psych class I took, and not necessarily MCAT prep. But there was I think it was a famous paper or a famous study that like pioneered like the 7 ± 2 clusters, right? That you can hold in working memory, and I use that with students actually a lot because it's so true. Like if you can group things together, it's so much easier to understand. And like not to get too far off topic, but like my favorite example of this is equilibrium with respect to acid-base chemistry and solubility. Because all three of those things, you throw in the Chatelier's principle in there, or a little bit of thermodynamics in there, they are all quite literally the exact same thing. It's just different, it's
Different
different
names.
flavors of cake,
Yeah.
right? It's just
Yeah.
cake. And so when you cluster things that way, it makes it easier to remember information to a higher capacity. And I think as far as working memory goes, that would maybe be the only other thing that comes to mind from an MCAT testable standpoint. In my experience, I haven't seen them get specific in terms of like the components of working memory. Like you've got your central executive, like you mentioned,
Yep.
there's the episodic buffer, and there's like the sound thing, I think, and there's another component. And this is not a robust or very legitimate means by any stretch, but generally if I don't remember something in how long I've been tutoring, it's probably not important. Not always, but usually. Although,
This is probably one of those things, though. It's not important. I agree with you.
yeah. And so I think to recap, if we were to summarize like the main things to understand from those first two memory stores, the sensory and the short term / working, what would you say are like the big, must knows?
I mean, so big things that I think are important. Number one is kind of like the capacity of each of these things. So like
Yes.
sensory memory is like a couple of seconds, like a second or two's worth of information, right?
Yeah.
Um, and hopefully, I'll give an example in a moment, but and then working memory, I think as well, like we haven't talked quite as much about this, but like working memory is really limited as well, right? And you said like the 7 ± 2. I'm thinking about like using an interpreter in the hospital. Like you give a phone call to the interpreter, and like so many times I've like given this spiel, and then they're like, "Can you like give me a smaller piece because I forgot what you said at the beginning?" You know what I mean? And so they
Yeah.
can't hold all of that, and it's something that's being manipulated, right? It's not just they're listening to it and regurgitating it; they're like having to change, like convert it from one language to another. And so that's like a good example of what working memory might look like, and its limited capacity, that you can't give too many words or too many ideas at once because we can only hold so much. Those are, I think, the important
Right.
things, and the short term being similar, although you're maybe not having the manipulation of those ideas.
Right. I think just to put numbers to it, like you said, sensory memory up to a couple seconds. I've seen it tested like once. I can't remember where, but just generally noting that echoic memory or sound lasts a little bit longer than iconic. If I remember correctly, echoic might be up to like 2 seconds, whereas
Mhm.
iconic is a little bit less than 1 second. And I always try to remember, like, okay, if I were to just suddenly turn the lights off, how long would it take for me to see black? And it's
Yeah,
usually like a smidge under a second.
yeah, yeah.
And
Less than a
so
second.
I think that's helpful. And then short term slash working, we're thinking like up to 15 or so seconds, 15 to 30.
I would also just note that, we're kind of taking it in this linear fashion, like, oh, first things are sensory memory, and then they're
Right.
working, then they're short term. But like, I would hope that you guys are like listening to us right now and like paying attention and trying to like work through these things as we talk through them. So those things wouldn't be in your sensory memory, right? Because sensory memory is like things, like you said, Ahmed, that we're not putting conscious effort into,
Right.
kind of things that are going on in the background. And so not everything will take this specific pathway through all these steps, but things can kind of go directly into your working memory or your short-term memory if you're really like soaking that up and, potentially manipulating the information that you're getting and trying to fit it into other semantic buckets and things like that.
Right. Right. I think understanding that there is a sort of dynamic, interplay between those stores at hand. But now the $1 million question I think every MCAT student has is like, okay, stuff's in working memory. How do I get it into long-term memory and make sure it doesn't disappear?
Yeah.
And I think that's where, we get into a couple of things here. We get into the actual long-term encoding process, and then the different sort of buckets in which we store information within long-term memory. I think generally, and curious to hear your experience here, Eric, encoding in terms of like the specific types of encoding, not a huge component of the MCAT. That's more of a psych course kind of deal. I remember when I was studying, we learned about semantic encoding versus like self-referent encoding, versus visual or acoustic encoding.
Yeah.
Not things that I've seen, at least definitely not frequently on the MCAT.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I think from an MCAT perspective, the important thing in my mind is, and we kind of touched on this at the beginning, but like as far as encoding goes to long-term memory, I would be thinking more about like what strategy can I use to encode information for the MCAT? You know what I mean? Not
Right,
like what I need to know about encoding. Um,
right.
I think, you know, they can always ask about anything, but I think the main things
Yeah.
for me is that there is like a benefit to repetition, right? We talk about spaced repetition. We talk about using Anki.
Yeah,
Probably everyone's heard us talk about that. And
yeah.
honestly, I'll just say, I mean, when I took the MCAT, I didn't even use Anki. I used Quizlet, and I just quizzed myself like periodically.
Yeah.
Which, looking back at it, I'm like, why did I do that? I just didn't want to get on the train, of using Anki. But the idea being like, if you are learning today about Le Chatelier's principle for the first time, and then you are like, okay, I'm going to look at this again in 3 weeks. Like 3 weeks are going to go by and you're going to have no idea what you're looking at. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so the idea behind the spaced repetition as part of this long-term memory and coding is that we give ourselves a short period of time initially to repeat a concept or to give ourselves a repeated exposure to something. And then over time, we can space that time interval out, and we'll be able to keep that information around for longer. So, if I'm learning a new principle today, maybe I'm looking at it right now. I'm gonna go do something else, and I'll come back to it in an hour and spend another
Right.
5-10 minutes on it, and then I'm gonna come back to it tomorrow night, and then maybe I'll take a few days off and do some other things, and then I'm gonna come back to it at the end of the week. You know what I mean? So I think that's. I don't think the value of the spaced repetition can be overstated. I think it's super helpful for encoding facts, um,
Yeah.
which is helpful. You know what I mean? The other thing that I think is important to recognize as far as encoding of long-term memory is, and you touched on this, but kind of semantic encoding. And so the idea behind the semantic encoding being that you're like effortfully considering and processing these ideas. Like I said earlier, you're kind of like putting them into buckets, you're grouping them with other similar concepts, you're relating them to, and like the idea that you gave about equilibrium and Le Chatelier and acid base,
Right.
like the fact that you're thinking about those things and recognizing that they kind of get grouped together is going to be something, because you made the effort, is going to stick with you longer. And, I think the spaced repetition is great. But at the end of the day, like, maybe people would have different opinions on this, but like, if you ask me, the MCAT is not about knowing facts. You have to know some facts, but I really believe that it's about understanding concepts and understanding the test. And so if you
Agreed.
have an understanding of concepts and can fit them together and relate them one to another, relate other things, subcategories and things like that, like, I think far outweigh the factoids that you can give yourself on a flashcard. And so, like, when I talk to students about what they're putting on their flashcards and things, I don't want you to have a one-word answer on the back of your flashcard. Like, that's memorizing a fact. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where I would much rather have, I think it's much more valuable. Now we're really talking about like encoding, and we that's kind of a little bit beyond what we were going to talk about today. But I think you really have to put in the effort and yeah, I think I've said it before, but I think grouping things, relating things, recognizing these relationships and how concepts work together and fit together is the most important thing that you can do when studying.
Yeah. And I mean, to tie back to those different types of encoding, this is where I say, like, don't memorize terms, just understand what words mean, right? Like, acoustic encoding is likely something to do with sound, right? And saying things out loud. Visual encoding is fairly straightforward. Semantics, right? As we know from studying language, right? Meaning of things, right? Encoding by meaning, right? Self-referent encoding, probably encoding in reference to myself, right? Oh, this is very similar to that thing I did, right? And as you can probably imagine, semantic and self-referent are the most resistant to forgetting. That is almost certainly not testable, but applicable from a standpoint of, we're students that are trying to be able to retain and apply a high volume of information. And so treat that as, studying advice more than studying material. If that makes sense. What's much more important are the branches of long-term memory. And this is something that is, not, super convoluted, but can be easily confusing. I think, the starting point, we want to differentiate between explicit and implicit, or declarative and non-declarative. And I think the names kind of tell us a lot that we need to know here. And I've seen them presented either way. I'm sure you have as well, Eric. But the main thing here, the main difference between those two branches is, is it conscious recall, or is it, does it just kind of happen? Right.
Yeah.
And so is there an easy, I don't know, is there an easier way, or is there another way that you sort of think about those two branches?
No, I think I'm thinking about what you said just 2 minutes ago, which is, I guess, in my short-term memory, which is that, like, you don't have to memorize the terms, but like think about what something means, right? Like if you can remember, even just, I was going to say, if you can remember that explicit is declarative, it's very obvious, but even explicit, like the word itself means like kind of, I guess I wouldn't know a definite, I wouldn't be able to use my explicit memory to like determine a definition, but it's like something that's spelled out for you, right?
yeah.
So it's like something that you're able to say, whereas the implicit is something that's implied. It's not spoken, but it's, suggested is what how I would, try to define that. And so thinking
Right.
about it in these terms, I think if you can start with that, then you'll be able to, if you have an idea of what these other like kind of subcategories are, then you'll be able to place them pretty easily.
Right.
Because I think, it's a mutually exclusive but collectively exhaustive group of things, right? Implicit and
Yeah.
explicit. And under there, you have like every type of possible memory sort of thing that you can do. And so I think it's a perfect like initial grouping. And then we can kind of go from there and talk more specifics about what fits into each of those.
Yeah. I think ultimately the biggest thing is, do you have to think about it or not? And, I think it may be, we can approach it either way, but like think about the things that you don't have to remember, right? Sorry, the things that you don't have to like consciously attend to,
Yeah.
right? I don't think about how to walk, right? Fortunately, I'm sure, there's other people that may have to because they're rehabbing from an injury, right? And that would be different. But anything that's routine, right? Anything that's
Yeah.
quote unquote muscle memory, and anything that's emotional memory. I would say those are probably the two main, you know, branches of that non-declarative implicit
Implicit.
branch.
I would also fit in there like, and we're not touching on this, but as part of memory and learning, a lot of times we talk about conditioning. We did an episode a few weeks ago about conditioning, and
Yeah.
like a conditioned response, right? Like it's exactly what you're saying. Like you're not thinking about it, it's just happening. And so a
Yes.
conditioned response as well, I would put in this kind of implicit memory bucket.
That is a huge connection, definitely. And to and this is ironic, but to be a little more explicit in the sub branches, the muscle memory is what we more formally term procedural memory,
Yeah.
right? Memory of executing certain procedures, riding a bike, swimming, right? Writing, anything that's a skill, right? Like a skill-based memory. And then the emotional memories, um, I remember it would have been 2 summers ago. I was in Vancouver, and a really, really close friend of mine, just I think it would have been a year or two prior, had a really bad bike accident in Vancouver. Long story short, Vancouver's got a lot of hills, and she was going down one, and her brakes just like didn't work. And so she's kind of weaving through like intersections. Fortunately, didn't get hit, but Vancouver's, like I mentioned, is very hilly. And so she got to the end of one of the hills. It was a ledge. And so she ended up kind of like swerving into like a forest. Long story short, she like had a meniscus tear, a concussion, and like a couple of fractures, which all things considered, like could have been much worse. But
Yeah.
in any case, we were back in Vancouver for a really big tournament that I was playing in, and a couple of our friends were playing in. So big group of us went, and we were on a city bus or something, and that friend started crying at one point, and I didn't understand why in the moment, but I realized later we had driven past like the intersection where her brakes gave out.
Yeah.
And so that emotional memory kicked in. And we all sort of experience it too. And it's not always the bad emotions or the sad emotions, but you remember that time where you won something, or you had family over, or like just any positive experience. You can feel like that sense of joy, or that sense of whatever emotion you experience there. And maybe for you, Eric, that's a good thing to talk about heading into tomorrow, is that day one of year one of residency, and the positive emotions that hopefully you had that day. Maybe a little bit of stress, but uh, we'll
I'm
stay
trying,
positive for.
I'm trying to remember what the first day of residency was for me. I can't even, I think I was in an urgent care clinic, and they were probably pretty nice to me. So I hope they'll be nice to me again tomorrow.
Yeah, perfect. Well, hey, rely on that.
I'm thinking, sorry to interrupt you,
No, you
but
go for it.
I'm just thinking about my, like, it's kind of funny sometimes how these implicit memories will work,
Yeah,
because, and you'll have, I mean, maybe not this experience, but like you'll probably learn to sew during your surgery rotation in, a couple of years. And, depending on what service you're on, like our med school was pretty good about like having a boot camp where they taught us to sew before we started. And usually they start by teaching you how to suture and tie knots with the instruments, like with the
yeah,
needle driver and stuff. And honestly, that's how we do it in derm as well. But on the surgery rotations that you do as a med student, usually like gen surge, like colorectal surgery and trauma surgery and stuff like that. In these big OR cases, and probably Jaden does this as well. Like they'll suture with they'll tie knots with their hands. So they'll like place the needle and then
right.
put the needle driver instrument down, and take the suture in two hands and do this tying, kind of like, I want to call it a dance, but like
Yeah,
this, I don't know. It's not like
technique.
normal over under like tying a shoelace. You know what I mean? It's like this kind of weird way that they have a couple of different ways to do it. One's called a two-handed tie, one's called a one-handed tie. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But when you first learn it, you're like, what is this? And like, why do we do it this way?
Yeah,
Um, but I remember like, I was interested in surgery. I tried really hard to learn how to tie well. And you're putting like so much effort into learning how to do this so you don't look stupid if you ever get asked to do it in a real case.
yeah,
And like, on your scrubs, like you have two like ties to tie your scrubs together. And like I would just sit there with my scrub ties and like tie knots and tie knots, and like with my shoelaces, tie knots and tie knots.
yeah,
And then at one point, like I remember I was tying knots and I forgot like what was the next step? Like how do I do the next move?
yeah,
And I was like thinking it through and thinking it through. I couldn't figure it out. And then I just like put it down for a second and restarted. And I just started tying knots again, like I hadn't missed a beat. And so it was interesting because like I had spent so much like processing power to learn this skill, and
right.
talk about muscle memory. At that point, like it wasn't necessarily something that I could articulate, but I was just doing it. You know what I mean? And that's kind of
Yeah,
what this implicit memory is, right? Like you can't necessarily explain it. It's just something that you do. It's like something that happens to you. Same like you said, riding
right.
bikes, when I think are great examples as well. But it becomes something that's just so kind of natural to you, that you're not having to think about it anymore.
Yeah, and I think as soon as you said that, I was like, oh yeah, I've been there where like you're in the middle of something and you're like, wait, what? And then you just start over. It's like, okay.
Yeah,
Because it's
yeah,
you're almost adding more data points for your brain to recognize, and like, oh wait, yeah, this is what comes next.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And not to expose my sister, but she's very much like that with like song lyrics. She'll be like
Mm.
midway through a lyric in the shower and she'll like wait. And then she'll just like go back a couple of lines and then she'll get it. I'm like,
Then
that's
remembering, yeah,
hilarious.
yeah.
And like, cause we at like my family's house, we have like a Jack and Jill bathroom. So we share the same bathroom and it
Yeah.
connects like between our rooms.
So you hear her singing in the shower.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. She was saying like 10 minutes ago, actually.
That's why you were
uh,
muting, huh?
can't confirm or deny, but
Yeah.
Yeah, listen, she loved my sister, but that's not a vocalist that you want me to unmute for.
Brutal. Brutal.
But in any case, I think, I've even just like from an MCAT standpoint, like following pathways. Like sometimes I remember when I was studying the citric acid cycle, like sometimes I would get to a molecule and I was like, wait, where am I again? And then I sort of zoom out a little bit. It's like, oh, and then you can kind of pick up and keep
Yep.
going. One of the, I guess, kind of cool parts of procedural memory is sometimes you got to take a step back and then you're able to take many steps forward. But on the other side now, going to the explicit side, I think that's probably where people get confused more frequently than not is the episodic versus the semantic memory. And this is, one of the most semantic memory in particular is like one of the most poorly taught, I think, concepts out there. Like a lot of people teach it as facts, and then episodic is everything else. And so people think, okay, well, if it's a fact, if it's something that I can't argue, then it must be semantic. And that's not always true. The way that I've kind of taught it, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts here as well, Eric, I tell students that semantic memory is all of the Googleable facts. And what I mean by that is you can't, unless you're a celebrity, but I've never had the privilege of tutoring a celebrity, you can't Google what street you lived on in 4th grade, right? You can't Google the name of your sophomore year biology teacher. You can't Google, your dad's middle name, right?
Yeah.
These are dad's middle name isn't the best example, but anything that you've lived,
Yeah.
is episodic.
Yeah. I like
Anything that you can look up is semantic.
It's semantic.
Right. And so where people get tripped up a lot is, remembering what street you lived on when you were 4 years old. They'll say that's semantic because it's a fact. And that's why I try to say if you can't Google it, it's probably episodic. If you can Google it, like what time is it in Philadelphia right now? That's going to be semantic because you need to know, okay, well, this is my time zone. The Eastern time zone is X hours ahead or behind. That must mean it's, 9:39 in Philadelphia right now, etc. Curious to hear, like, have you ever taught it a different way or seen it a different way?
I like that. I like that a lot. I think I totally agree with you. I think that's where people get tripped up is exactly those kind of scenarios. For me, I usually tell people, well, first I tell them that I think of it like you're saying, like, here's what semantic is. It's anything that you can Google, and episodic is everything else. I kind of do it the opposite where I say, I tell you what episodic is and everything else is semantic.
Yeah, fair enough.
But my episodic is like, if you were hanging out with, like a grandparent and they were like telling you stories about like, when I was your age and like what like things about their life, right? So very kind of similar thing, like non-Googleable information, like things they live, things that happen to them.
The back in my day stories.
Back in my day stories, exactly. Those are like, and maybe there's some exceptions there, but by and large, those are the things that they've lived. I would say those are the episodic things versus the semantic things, which is everything else. But I also, to make it a little bit more personal, which I think, can be helpful for students. And honestly, I feel like I've said this to students before, not infrequently, and I often hear like, oh yeah, that I feel like that's me too. Is that like I don't think there's probably, if there is data about this, I'm not familiar with it, but like sometimes I wonder if there's a trade-off between these two types of memory. Like there's only so much declarative memory that you have, just because like I'm a good test taker, like I'll own that. I'm good at taking tests. It's one of my strengths. And so my semantic memory is good, like I can learn these facts. I can put things together and I can learn the relationships. But when it comes to telling a story about my own life, I'm terrible about it. Like if you were to hang out with me and my wife and she would be like, Eric, tell Ahmed about that time that we, went like gator fishing in Florida or something. And I would be like, have we ever done that before? Like we could have had like, a week-long vacation, and I would be like, I don't remember anything about that. You know what I mean? And so,
Right.
I'm being facetious kind of, but I think it's helpful to kind of think of those things, kind of put them together in the same bucket of, the episodic or declared, or excuse me, the declarative memory, the explicit or declarative memory, and say
Right.
like these are the two components. And when it comes to Eric, like one is kind of taking away from the other one. You know what I mean? And like I said, I don't think there's
Yeah.
probably any data to support that. But I kind of just use that example to kind of help people remember like what are the two types of declarative memory and how can we remember them in relation to each other,
Exactly. I think, yeah, whatever way you sort of conceptualize it, as long as we're aware of the difference and we can associate an example with each one.
Mhm.
I think across the board in psych that's the way to go. There's similar terms in pretty much every topic on psych. Knowing them individually is great, but when they both or all of them appear as answer choices to the same question, that's where it's going to really test you, right? And so we have to be able to know the differences between things. And I think associating examples with terms is the single best way to do that. Like, role conflict, role strain is a, textbook example of, similar terms where if you have an example of each, it makes it really easy to remember the difference.
Yeah.
But I guess on the opposite note of remembering, to wrap up, let's talk about forgetting, which is the kryptonite of every MCAT student. Is, we go through something, it's great, and then a week later, it's like, shoot, what was that again? And so a couple of different things to touch on here. And I think, forgetting is just a component of what we can more generally term, decay, right?
Sure.
Or loss of information. And so tying back to what you said earlier with spaced repetition, that's a very effective way to sort of decrease the slope of that forgetting curve. I think it's called the Ebbinghaus curve, if I remember correctly. But every time you go through spaced repetition, your floor increases and the slope of decay decreases, which is a good thing. From an MCAT standpoint, in terms of that being explicitly tested, I haven't seen it frequently. I think it's possible. I think it's more likely than, the difference between short-term versus working memory, for example.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it's something critical, more so just back to like test taking advice.
Yep.
More importantly, more explicitly testable, we're thinking types of amnesia and interference.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'll be honest, interference, I mean they're kind of similar, right? I think they're similar in that we have to know how like the anterograde and retrograde thing works. And
Right.
so in either of these cases, let's talk about amnesia first. When you talk about retrograde amnesia, you are having like current experiences that are interfering or not interfering, but like preventing you from having previous memories. You're having a hard time remembering things that happened in the past, I guess is what I
Right.
would say. Whereas anterograde amnesia being you can't moving forward, like that's what anterograde means, right? Like retrograde moving back, anterograde moving forward. Moving forward, we can't create new memories.
Yeah.
Um,
I
did,
think, when I think about these two types of amnesia, I always think of like characters in movies.
I was gonna bring up a movie. What movie are you bringing up?
I was going to think of 50 First Dates.
That is exactly what I was gonna say, dude. That is
Yeah.
exactly.
Was it was it Drew Barrymore that played the
Drew
girl?
Barrymore, Drew Barrymore,
Yeah.
and Adam Sandler. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good movie. If y'all haven't seen that, you should. It's a good one.
Man, there was an era of Adam, sorry, not to get too off topic, but there was a golden era of like Adam Sandler movies, like before Jack and Jill and after Billy Madison, where like
Yeah,
they were like actually
it was
like
just
good
gold.
movies.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then it just like it, you know, bleep hit the fan and it
Yeah.
turned into a circus, but that's a story
Good
for
good
another day.
things good things never last, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. But and so Drew Barrymore's character in that movie, for anybody who hasn't seen it, it's called 50 First Dates because Adam Sandler has to basically make that girl fall in love with him like every single day, like from scratch. Because if you think, and I'll give you guys a second to maybe think about what type of amnesia she may have. But basically, she lives in the moment, and then like she forgets that previous stuff, and so she only really has what's like current. Granted, that story is maybe scientifically fabricated a little bit, but
Not very
uh,
likely, but a good example though, right? So she has a gap between like previous days and today. I think she always goes back to like the same date of when she had some sort of head injury or accident or something. So like
exactly.
say it was 2 years ago, then she would wake up today and think it's July of 2022. And then tomorrow she would wake up and think it's July of 2022 again. And so every day she's unable to formulate a memory.
Right.
I guess in reality, she kind of has retrograde and anterograde going
I,
on,
I was
right?
gonna say, like during the day, she has retrograde
Retrograde. Because she can't
because
remember what happened yesterday, the day before, and the day before, but she's cognizant of what's happening right now, and she can
right.
remember what's going on throughout the day.
And then she
Yeah.
goes to bed, and now it's anterograde in the sense that she has nothing going forward, but she remembers everything pre head injury.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think generally when we think of like retrograde amnesia, right? It's the inability to think of older memories, whereas anterograde is the difficulty forming newer memories. When I think of anterograde, I tend to think of the elderly. You know,
Mm.
if you ever visit a grandparent or a great grandparent, they may think their child is still, in their 30s, 40s, or 50s, when really their child may be in their like 60s or 70s, and they may not have a full recollection of what's going on presently, but they remember the past. And
Yeah.
so that would be sort of my two examples for amnesia specifically. And just to clarify again, amnesia is the formation of memories or the recollection of existing memories. And in the case of retrograde amnesia.
Yeah. If you need a good retrograde example, you can just think of me, who is starting dermatology residency, and I'm going to learn everything there is to know. But I can't tell you about the time that I went alligator hunting in Florida, which actually never happened, but I forget things in the past, you know what I mean? But I'm gonna pick things up. I'm gonna be able to learn moving forward, you know.
Right. Fair enough.
Maybe
Now,
not a perfect example, but
well, it works for the context we're dealing with. But to contrast that now with interference, which I think is important because I think those are two things that are easy to mix up. Amnesia, we're thinking memories. Interference is actually encoding, right?
yeah,
So proactive, retroactive interference, I guess if we're thinking about this chronologically, would occur prior to retrograde/interrograde amnesia because one's looking at encoding, one's looking at retrieval of existing information for long-term memory. And so I want to emphasize that distinction there. But looking at interference, similar idea where the word kind of tells you what's getting messed up, right? So
yeah,
retrograde amnesia, it's the past memories that we're having trouble with.
yeah,
Anterograde amnesia, it's the new memories that we're having trouble with. And so if we apply that to interference, proactive, retroactive, it starts to make a little more sense, right? Proactive interference means, new information we're having trouble encoding,
yeah.
which means it's the existing info that's getting in the way,
It's concrete problems. Yeah.
right? And
Mhm.
so for me, I lived this very recently. I had to get all my credit cards reissued because I'm on an account with my mom because she works at a bank, and having her on my account just gives me certain advantages.
Yeah.
And I guess she had an issue with one of her debit cards, which basically meant all the cards on the account had to get reissued. And so I kept, because I have like Google Pay and Apple Pay. And so with Google Pay, you see like a list of all your saved cards, 5 of which are now no longer in service, and I kept
Yeah.
like using the wrong card when I used Google Pay.
Yeah.
And so that's proactive interference. I don't remember the last 4 digits of my new card because I'm so used to that old credit card.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great example. When I don't have great examples for these, but usually when I think about retrograde interference, I think about, and honestly, I can't even tell you like the specifics of this, but I just remember I read a book one time about like the Bush Cheney presidency. This is a big, thick book. It was called Days of Fire.
Okay.
And there's something about how like George W. Bush, like he was a new president when 9/11 went down,
Yeah.
uh, and those planes crashed into the two towers, and like I think he was like in a kindergarten class or
Yep.
something when he got the news, right?
Yep.
And there's like video of him receiving the news, and he was like, he like got some news, and I don't remember exactly what happened, but later he was asked to recall like what happened and how he reacted, and he like told something that was very not consistent with like the video evidence that there was. Like, for example, this may be completely wrong, but like maybe he in reality had like sat there and not really done anything at first, and then maybe someone came back and told him again, and then he got up and left the room and did something. And when they asked him about it later, he was like, oh yeah, as soon as I heard, I like ran out the door and I like got on Air Force One immediately, which is
Yeah.
like not what happened, right? And so the
Yeah.
idea being like he had this memory, and when he went back to retrieve it, like, and this happens with retrieval when we're retrieving memories from the past, every time we retrieve a memory, like it can change a little bit. And so you can get that interference in that way, and the memory will kind of change over time to where your recollection of what happened is like just not really what happened at all, right? And so you
Right.
have maybe current memories or a current perception, like in that example, maybe a perception that like 9/11 was a terrible thing, required like a lot of urgency and action on the part of the US government. And so like if I'm George Bush in 2020, nothing against George Bush at all, but just for the example's sake, if I'm George Bush in 2020, I'm thinking like this was a huge deal, and like I did everything I could to like try to address this threat. And so with that like perception in mind, the way I'm thinking that I responded when it happened is like I did everything I could. Like I immediately called my advisors, and I immediately, like got up and sprung into action. You know what I mean? And
Right.
so that idea that like our recollection of memories of experiences that we've had can be altered. I don't want to say falsified, but like,
Right.
made less true than they really are because we have
Yeah.
current experiences, current perceptions that are interfering in this retrograde fashion, and kind of messing up those original memories.
Yeah, and I think, that could be a topic for another day, looking at intrusion errors and source monitoring errors. And, there's more to memory than just what we've gone into today. But yeah, I think that's a perfect, place to wrap up is, we talked about proactive interference is learning the new credit card, whereas retroactive interference, you're having trouble remembering the old stuff. New school teacher, uh, you know, quickly learns the new students' names and forgets her old,
Mm-hmm.
students, right? And for me, having been playing sports for a while, I remember my most recent teammates. I have trouble. Not actually, no, that's not true. But let's suppose I have trouble remembering teammates from my freshman year of college, right? That would be a good retroactive interference, and it's things that are interfering with like that encoding process. Whereas with amnesia, we're thinking retrieval more specifically.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think to summarize, we've gone through, the main memory stores. And as per usual, right, big emphasis is placed on conceptualizing information, and just understanding what words mean, because that can really help in terms of keeping the terms separate and also applying examples to terms to get a clearer visual of the distinction between them. And there's lots of good information that we discussed tonight that applies not just things to know for the MCAT, but things to know in life in terms of how to study and how to maximize retention and mitigate forgetting. Anything to add there, Eric?
No, I mean, I would just use these strategies, use these strategies to try to learn and code the things that we've talked about. You know what I mean? Really
Yeah.
think it through, attach it to other concepts. Don't just write flashcards and hope that that's going to be enough for you, because it's not.
No one-word answers.
Yeah, no one-word answers.
Awesome.
I don't want to see it. I don't want to hear about that.
Yeah, you heard the man. In any case, I think, there, like we said, there's a lot of great advice there. Hopefully, our listeners are able to take something from that today and apply it to their day-to-day studying. But on that note, guys, thank you again for listening to another episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast. Happy studying, and we'll see you guys on the next episode. Take care, everybody.